I was doing everything. I was the guy that when you would call, pick up the phone and say, "How can I help you? How can we be a service provider?" And then I worked my way up. It just so happened that a mentor of mine on the committee, his legislative assistant left, and they offered me, they were like, "You work very well with him. Do you want to fill in that role?" Which is like kind of a junior Asia legislative assistant, and I just said I'd be honored to. So
Welcome to Career Cheat Code. In this podcast, you'll hear how everyday people impact the world through their careers. Learn about their journey, career hacks, and obstacles along the way. Whether you're already having the impact you want or are searching for it, this is the podcast for you.
All right. Francisco, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to reconnect with you. We met through a fellowship, which you were an alumnus of, and I was just starting about a year ago now. And, we've been connected ever since, so I appreciate you taking the time for this.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm actually going to the fellowship, the International Career Advancement Program, in a couple weeks to be a mentor, and I'm super excited about it.
That's awesome. Great.
Hopefully get a chance to talk about it later.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. Let's tell the world what it is you do for a living.
So I am a senior advisor at the USAID Agency for International Development, and my specialty or focus is the People's Republic of China, or just China. As folks might know, China launched what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, and really changed the game when it comes to global development. And so it's my job to advise senior leaders about development issues with respect to China.
Great. How long have you been doing this?
Funny you ask, because I'm actually this month hitting my 1 year mark. And so it's a little bit really serendipitous to be doing this at the 1 year mark. So
That's great. So tell me more about what this looks like. So you walk in on a Monday. What does your job look like? What are you preparing for folks, and how are you staying on top of the knowledge that you need to advise people?
So it's not a very typical job for U.S. Agency for International Development, or we sometimes say USAID for short. A lot of my colleagues, and part of the beauty of working in such a place, is that a lot of my colleagues are development professionals. So that means they're environmental scientists, or public health engineers, or economists. It's really their job to help create programs that help support development of many of the partners we work with internationally. My days are a little bit different, though. It's my job to work with various U.S. government entities, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps, a whole host of U.S. agencies, to really help help policymakers, help senior leaders in my agencies think about the PRC, which we use sort of as a short name for China. I'll say my day to day, to be honest, it's I have a lot of flexibility on my schedule, but it's somewhere between talking to scholars on what just happened last week, where over 50 African leaders went to Beijing to talk about global development issues, or a lot of internal meetings to think about how we can showcase our comparative advantage when it comes to development issues all over the world.
So it sounds like a lot of your work is really dependent on intel gathering from other agencies and from what's happening on the ground. You're doing this based out of DC, right?
Correct. Yeah. But the beauty of working in a place like USAID is that we have offices in over 100 countries all around the world. And in many places, particularly emerging economies, we have entire USAID missions. So this means development professionals who are part of the Foreign Service. We have civil servants, and then Foreign Service nationals, which means local partners, people from those countries who help advise USAID on building the development of their countries. We work with them every day. We exchange information about what they're seeing on the ground, and I share them sort of what the policy conversations are here in Washington, D.C.
Can you share with us what's your favorite part of your role and what's the most challenging part?
Yeah, so I alluded a little bit to what part of my favorite part. So I come more from a foreign policy, national security background. So I used to work at the Department of State for 3 years. I was on Capitol Hill on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 5 years. And being in a place like USAID, you have some of the smartest people in the world, whether it's public health professionals, environmentalists, engineers. And then you're like, let's come together to address one of the biggest geopolitical challenges in our time, which is the US China relationship. As I think both, whether it's in the news, even as recent as important political debates as yesterday, folks know that there's a lot of focus right now on China, right? And so whether we're talking about surviving a global pandemic, China is part of every aspect of global development issues. It's sort of like bringing this really fascinating group of people and that are already really smart to really just connect national security into that world.
So that sounds fascinating. So tell me more about, how does one arrive in this type of career, right? Like, how do you get to a point where you're doing this type of work?
I was always interested in foreign policy. As a little kid, I was raised by a single mom, only child, and my mom always wanted to be a flight attendant, in part because she wanted to see the world. And so the two of us would just we would look online for cheap flights, try to travel the world. And so at an early age, even through very few means, we were able to just kind of make it work and, see the world. And sort of that interest in foreign policy, not only from my mom's upbringing, but the fact that most of my family already lived abroad, whether it's in Ecuador or Dominican Republic, meant that I was just surrounded by foreign policy, I like to say. And then I also lived in Queens, New York, which I don't know how many people know this, but it's the most diverse place in the entire world. And so I had literally Tibet, like food and just people and culture and diaspora in my backyard, to Colombia and Bangladesh, like literally a block away. And so really that cocktail of all three just made me really fascinated in foreign policy. Of course, I didn't know how to get there. I just had a ton of curiosity. When I was in college and in high school, I joined the policy debate team. So I was automatically the coolest kid in high school and spent a lot of my weekends, just debating with other really cool people about policy issues. And sometimes I pinch myself because I find that some of the things I used to debate about over 10 years ago are some of the things that still come up today. So, for example, we would debate as to whether the U.S. should sign the Law of the Sea Treaty. And the first Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing I was able to go was when the chairman was debating whether the U.S. should sign the U.S. Law of the Sea Treaty. And so it was a very cool moment. And so I grew up spending my weekends and for a little around 10 years just researching and being fascinated with policy debate and increasingly foreign policy debate. Maybe just to make a story a little bit longer, but that I still didn't know how to get there, right? Washington, D.C. can kind of be a little bit of a black box. It's very opaque. No one teaches you in school after the international relations course. No one's and this is how you get that job. I had a general sense that Washington, D.C. was the place to be, but I had no idea how to get there, no pathway, no pipeline. And certainly being a first generation kid, my parents were just happy so that I graduated, but really there was no, we were all figuring this out together. And so I was super fortunate that a alumni from my college debate program, Wake Forest Debate, was director at a think tank on national security issues. And so while I was, debating in one of my final rounds in my last tournament, like a national competitive tournament, I reached out to him and I was like, look, I don't know how, I don't know how I'm going to make this work, but I really would love to come to DC and maybe intern for you. And what was cool was these think tanks, I would read these reports as for debate tournaments, and they would be arguments that I would use. And so then to come to the city and be oh my God, you're so and so evidence, but you're a real person. And I spent so many weekends just talking about the briefing or report that you that you wrote, totally nerded out. And it was just a real cool full circle moment. Then reality hit. I had all the dreams of going to foreign policy and really learning about DC. I got an internship, luckily, which is, oftentimes very hard, and really just getting your foot in the door is really difficult, but had no way to pay for it. And so it was an unpaid internship, and living in DC is extremely expensive. Some folks probably know. I thought okay, I'll take all my college graduation money and I'll sort of live off that. That lasted about a month and a half, not even the full summer of my think tank internship. And I was really at a loss for figuring out what my next steps were. And so I started just trying to do different side jobs to try to make ends meet. I started coaching college debate to make some extra cash. And I was coaching a school in DC when I had to really sort of make a decision about housing. And again, unpaid internship, really wanted to be in foreign policy, didn't know how to afford it. So I asked the debate team if I could sleep on the floor of the back room of the debate office. And they were like, of course, just to make ends meet, are you sure? But also, we sort of talked it through. I promised them it would be temporary. I lasted there for 6 months. I was sleeping on the floor. I would go to the showers at the gym. I would eat at, DC receptions, whether think tanks or Capitol Hill receptions, which oftentimes offer free appetizers, really because I just wanted to get into foreign policy. And I was so lucky that I had an internship, and even if it was unpaid, but I didn't know how to sort of translate that into a full job. It was really difficult for my parents to also understand that, in part because, first generation kid. My dad was suffering from cancer at the time, and he was just like, "What do you mean they're not paying you? Like, what is that concept? Is just like didn't even make sense to people who are not from here, and frankly, it shouldn't. It would like really cause some tough conversations with my parents, but I knew I wanted to pursue my dreams. Long story short, and we can sort of get delve deeper into this. I hustled for a really long time, like I mentioned. I leveraged my network and had a couple of unpaid internships in that process. I thought I was going to be a permanent unpaid intern, and after a year of doing internships, I finally landed my first job as a staff assistant on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
So you did a lot there. First of all, you came in. It sounds like your parents are from Dominican Republic and Ecuador. Did I hear that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And growing up in New York City, that is a whole, as you said, it is a kind of a mosh posh of everybody, just kind of in the same place. So I understand why certainly curiosity sparks and learning about other cultures and just thinking about all of that. And then you go off and do debate at Wake Forest and you graduate and you decide, you know what, let me take my talents down to DC and see what I can do there. I think even just your story of the dedication to say, you know what, I'm going to sleep on the floor and do this. And certainly as somebody that has Latino parents, the concept of not getting paid for work is foreign, which it should be. It's probably not something that we should encourage more, but just hearing the way that you persevered through it all to kind of land that first gig, and just having that determination and drive. Do you know what moment in your life sparked that desire to do foreign relations, or like where did that come from?
It must have been some point doing like it's a combination of like debate. I just like intellectually really was fascinated with reading a bunch of think tank reports about what the US, like everything from what our policy should be in the Middle East, which, very relevant now, but of course very academic back then, to, like I was the most obscure things like international agricultural subsidies and how dairy prices impacted trade and foreign policy, to really just like visiting my cousins in Ecuador and being like, what drove them and the rest of my family to come to the United States is a foreign policy issue. We oftentimes frame immigration as a domestic issue and forget that there are really important foreign policy elements to it.
Tell me more about kind of when you started narrowing into your desire to learn more about China and like Asia overall, right? Like that's, as someone that grew up in New York City to Latino parents, like that's not something that is the norm. So kind of what got you interested in that region specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and I thought a lot about it. In part because in undergrad I focused a little bit on Middle East issues and wrote my thesis on it around the so-called Arab Spring. But then, as a Latino, everyone's like, "You speak Spanish, so obviously you should do Latin America and Western Hemisphere issues." And then I was kind of like, nah, like I want to do something different. I want to be where, like, someone gave me great advice when I was an intern that was like, you don't want to focus on what the hot topic is now. You want to focus on the real national security conversations are going to be in 10 years from now. And I was sort of like reading and learning more about national security issues and what the debates were happening in Washington. And more people were telling me the center of gravity, both economically, politically, and security wise, were shifting to the Asia Pacific and then eventually being called the Indo Pacific. And China was a big part of that. And then while working, I went to grad school. I had an opportunity to take a bunch of classes on Southeast Asia and just Asia broadly. And I realized like a region like Southeast Asia is just as diverse as my home was in Queens. And we had a lot of diasporas and just both the diversity of complex issues from like North Korea nuclear issues to maritime issues in the South China Sea, to how do we address climate change in the context of the US-China relationship, to human rights issues both in China but also different parts of Southeast Asia. All to say, it was a really fascinating and complex issue, and it obviously still is, and increasingly I was drawn more and more to it. I'll say that when I started working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was doing everything. I was the guy that when you would call, pick up the phone and say, how can I help you? How can we be a service provider? And then I worked my way up. It just so happened that a mentor of mine on the committee, his legislative assistant left, and they were like, you work very well with him. Do you want to fill in that role? Which is like kind of a junior Asia legislative assistant, and I just said I'd be honored to. So
That's great. Okay, so I appreciate you kind of walking us through that and just getting first of all paid experience, right? Then getting on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, like that's great. For those that don't know, what does that committee do?
great question. It is the main committee whose job in Congress, particularly the Senate, to oversee and authorize legislation with respect to foreign policy. One of the most important things that committee does is that it authorizes and makes decision about whether the US, whether Congress gives the authority for the president to go to long-term conflict. It's sometimes called the authorization of use of military force. It also is the main committee that oversees U.S. accession to treaties. So it really has a huge role in foreign policy.
Yeah, so this also sounds like a great experience for you to see how that works and how it all comes together, and then also build your network within government, I'm sure, right? Where I'm sure now that you've been in government for for a longer period of time, like that pays its dividends, right? When you know who's at what offices and what they're looking for. So can you tell me more a little bit about how you are able to just continue to build on that career and like from that point?
It's a great question. I mean, at this point now, I've been working on Asia policy for 8 to 10 years, and it started on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But to your point, being on a committee, particularly as a 22 or 23-year-old, you really get an opportunity to do it at a very high level. Just even working the phones, we were not fully staffed. And one of the first major committee hearings we had was on the authorization of whether to go to war in Syria. It was around the time that Obama was debating military strikes in Syria. And I remember being a young staff assistant, having to put together the binder, but then also having to choose which think tank reports the chairman had to read. And I just felt like, just straight out of college, maybe this was a like consequence of peace and war was not was not something I was qualified to even put binders for. And sometimes the sort of imposter syndrome goes on today. Obviously, I've come a long way since then. I've both been in a lot of different conversations, both high level, but also just at the working level, and sort of seeing many, and just really read a lot. Got my master's degrees, and just been part of different fascinating conversations, and just met a ton of great people, and also just traveled a ton. So whether it's through work or through grad school, been fortunate to be able to just hear from experts directly that are in the countries that we're working on or working with our foreign policy towards, which I think there's really no alternative to something like that. So
Can you tell me more about your graduate programs and what did you do and what were you looking to get out of them?
yeah, so I went to Georgetown Security Studies program, and I did it night class. I did it in 2 years while I was still on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Was super happy and thrilled I got accepted to Georgetown University. And I also wanted to maintain working at the same time. I like the entire time I felt like I had lost an entire year almost kind of being an intern. Looking back at it, I really am thankful. Obviously the unpaid part sucked, but I'm grateful that I was able to have such a rich experience of so many internships. And in the process, meet some great people that I'm still friends with today. But so I went to Georgetown, night classes. One of the best parts about the program was that it gave you a stipend to really just do whatever you wanted with it. And I used it for a research study to 3 Southeast Asian countries. I focused my trip on maritime security. And, I sort of knew that if I needed to be credible, and really know about some of the countries I was working on, I needed to visit, talk to experts there, build my contacts, but have that both credibility, but also just learn from them. And so I just spent like an entire month. I took 4 weeks of vacation from work to really just do that, even though it certainly was important for work as well. So it was really fruitful.
Can you tell me more about, well, first, what was this a master's in what exactly? And then two,
Yeah,
do you feel like you've gotten what you wanted out of it?
so it was a master's in security studies under the School of Foreign Service. Georgetown has a couple different programs. This one was a little bit more defense and intelligence focused, and I actually really appreciated that because again, a lot of my time was focused talking to diplomats or development professionals. But I think taking classes with that focus on defense and intelligence issues really made me a holistic, well-rounded in terms of national security. Oftentimes at work now, we talk about the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And, I feel a little bit conversant in my ability to talk about all three. And I've been fortunate to work on two of them, both in State Department and now at the USAID.
Outside of your master's programs, Have you been part of any other professional development type of programs? One of which I know of for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So happy to start there. One of the most catalytic and maybe transformative fellowships I've been able to do is the International Career Advancement Program, which is a week-long program in Aspen, Colorado. It's organized by the University of Denver. It's short for ICAP as well, and it really focuses on mid-career professionals and advancing communities of color in national security space. To my knowledge, it's really one of the few and only mid-career programs that particularly focuses issues of equity, inclusion, and representation. But it's just also an incredible training. So skills based, really runs the gambits of talking to experts on a whole host of issues, but really creating a culture, respectability, inclusion, just really being authentic in a space that oftentimes doesn't have people that look like us, and really helping us collectively move to the next section, to the next level. So I'm super excited. There's something also about like disconnecting from DC or just from whatever your working environment is and being in the amazing mountains that are Aspen, Colorado, that just really makes everything just really all the more unique. But maybe I'll just say that going back a little bit to my story, when I was an intern, one of the organizations that I joined and really got involved in was the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association. So I was looking for an affinity group on the Hill, in part because I really wanted to get on the Hill. Spoiler, I ended up on the Hill. I remember talking to the president of that staff association, and that afternoon he asked me to forward him my resume because an opening showed up on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. When I joined and became a full-time staffer, I also joined officially the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association. I ultimately worked up to be president myself, and one of the things we're super proud of that our team was able to accomplish was working with my roommate at the time, but also an external NGO called Pay Our Interns. And they were able to mobilize Congress to start paying their interns through research and advocacy. So really to bring it full circle, my own story of not sort of unpaid internships being a barrier and access to foreign policy, we were able to really cause changes. And eventually he also convinced the State Department, and the organization lobbied the State Department to also pay their interns. So Congress and the State Department both started paying their interns and really made change one of the major barriers to getting your foot in the door.
No, absolutely. And I mean, and kudos to you, right, for not only going through the unpaid internship and what that did for you, but also thinking about ways to change that for others, right? I think there are different mentalities. There are some folks that just accept that unpaid internships is a thing and everyone did it. But there are folks that literally cannot afford to do that. And there are folks that have to sleep on the floor to do so. And that is a real barrier, especially if you're thinking about getting talented, diverse representation in these spaces that bring different perspectives. You're literally not going to get folks just because they cannot afford to find a
Place to
floor,
sleep.
yeah, to sleep in. You know what I mean? So
Right.
kudos to you all to kind of recognizing that and recognizing that it just needed to change more broadly. I appreciate that, and I'm sure many others do. And this is the type of effort that I'm sure there were a lot of folks that came together ultimately to make it happen. Kind of in the spirit of it all, like the contributions that we all make are very significant.
Thank you. But to your point, it really takes a village, it takes a community, and a lot of people came together for those. So
Yeah, absolutely. So let's fast track a little bit. You end up in the Center for Foreign Relations Committee. Tell me what happens after that.
So actually, it's so interesting because I was president of the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association, and it was a volunteer job, but I was obviously a full-time Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer. And I was kind of interested in like, how do I like bring some of the work on like, access to halls of power, representation, inclusion, but also like find like a Asia foreign policy twist. And some of the best conversations that I was fortunate and privileged to be in were really with human rights organizations, and really the amazing work they did to uplift, to find the release of political prisoners, to convince Congress to raise human rights issues, which oftentimes get short shrifted in national security conversations. And so I was like, I'd love to do that on the outside for a bit. I'd love to find what I've learned now at 5 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but really in a way that like helps build more doors for access to these halls of power. I was fortunate that I was working on legislation that dealt with genocide of the Rohingya people, which is a minority, was originally from Burma and had been displaced to Bangladesh into major parts of Southeast Asia through ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Amnesty International USA was making this legislation their top human rights campaign. And they reached out if we knew anyone who would be interested in leading that advocacy campaign for them. And I was like, I would love to. I wrote the legislation you're advocating for, and I know all the players, and I'd love to do so in a more grassroots, bringing all the tools that an international NGO can do. A couple iterations afterwards, and even after my time at Amnesty, the legislation that we were working on became law. That's sort of when I made my move to the human rights field in NGOs. And again, really important work, working on international human rights issues, uplifting, stateless populations. That I got to visit some of the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and just, like, kids would tell you the stories about sort of fleeing, persecution of the military, and how they lost their families in that way. And then I would work with communities in DC or as part of the diaspora so that they could testify before Congress, or
Mhm.
they could go to meetings to advocate for the plight of the Rohingya and other human rights groups in, the halls of Congress or the executive branch. And so to me, I was bringing some of the advocacy skills I learned both in Congress, but also even as just like advocating for change for paid internships, and really bringing those skills to bring social change on human rights issues in the Asia Pacific.
Can you also, and thank you for sharing that, right? How can you share any other places that your work has taken you to, and kind of what that experience has been like? Because I
Yeah,
think we think about this type of work that is, of course, international, and I know at this point you were not in in the government, right? But like you still have to travel to different places and keep abreast
exactly.
and understand what's going on. So can you speak a little bit about that?
In this job, I went to Bangladesh, but I traveled to Thailand, to Malaysia. What's really fascinating at this point in my career is that people stay in your life, right? Like every time I go to Thailand, which I was just there a couple weeks ago, I still make an effort to connect with my, Amnesty Thailand office. I couldn't meet them, but I stayed in touch with Amnesty Indonesia when I was in Jakarta. But like in part because, these are the people that define who you are, but also because you want them to know that we're all still one big part of a larger international movement. And whether I'm in government or not in government, we're still agents of change, certainly on human rights issues. Sometimes I'm an advocate on the outside, and sometimes I'm an advocate on the inside. But I've been super fortunate. I've been able to travel to different parts of the Asia Pacific.
What brought you back to government?
Somewhere in between there, I'd worked at a philanthropy called Open Society Foundation, and I'd reached a point where I was really excited about the work I was doing on the outside. I'd published. I was proud of some human rights wins we were able to do, and obviously the work continues. But I'd realized that there's still a lot of change you can do when you're in government and in the executive branch. And so, sort of maybe filling that story I was just sharing a bit ago, one of the first actions the Biden Harris administration took was calling the Rohingya crisis a genocide.
Mm,
And I was fortunate to be involved in some of those debates within US government. This was certainly one of the major actions I was advocating for when I was working for various human rights groups. Oftentimes we say that on human rights issues or atrocity prevention issues, you can't really tackle them if you don't really diagnose the problem that we're working on. And so being able to call it for what it was really important for many of the victims of genocide and crimes against humanity. And that was like year one of my time in government. And so really, in the past now almost 4 years that I've been back in government, but first time in the executive branch, been super fortunate with, sort of working for, a government where I've been able to, really cause international change. So.
Can you share any of the large differences that you've seen in the impact that you can make, or in how the impact can be tangible working on the executive branch versus the legislative branch?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the issues that I got to work on during my time at the Department of State was the Compact of Free Association, which sounds super wonky, but I promise you is maybe one of the most consequential foreign policy national security issues. So, after World War II, we had, as former territories, three now countries: the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, and the terms in which they became freely associated states became these compacts. And every 20 years, we renegotiate them. And it just so happened that we had to renegotiate them in the last couple of years. Now, this was all happening in a larger geopolitical context in which the PRC is certainly making huge investment and huge gains in the Pacific Islands. And so there's some public reporting about how China didn't want these countries to re-enter into a new compact with the United States and was actively working against that. And our relationship with the three countries I mentioned, and they're called sometimes the freely associated states, is super important for our entire leadership in the Pacific. So our ability to project power, to access free, seas, to be able to go from California to, Singapore and certainly to Taiwan, all depends on our ability to have access to the Pacific Islands or just have access to the Pacific. I mean, if we were denied that freedom of navigation and that freedom of overflight, that would be hugely consequential to national security issues. I was super fortunate that I worked on the negotiating team, and towards the end of it, became the deputy, negotiator on the team, and really learned a lot from both my team, but also the lead negotiator of these compacts. And issues of consequence like climate change to addressing health disparities in these islands to one of the issues that the Marshallese appropriately raised was issues of nuclear legacy and are the consequence of nuclear testing that we did in the run up to World War II. And so these issues have consequences decades later, and were some of the hardest issues to try to address in a way that obviously, supported mutual respect and mutual interest for both of our countries in the context of the Marshall Islands, but then ultimately for all of the islands that we had to negotiate with.
Let's pretend that all of the audience is here because they are all on the brink of leaving their jobs to go into international development or trying to become a policy lead of some sorts. What advice would you have to those folks?
Oftentimes, I say that you have to think about your three P's. So I think about it in terms of policy, politics, and process. You can know everything about US China policy, but that still might not land you that job you want in the China policymaking world. Why? Because you still need to know how government works. Or if you're working on budget issues in relation to China, you need to know how the budget works. Or I think one of the things that was so consequential for me, both in my advocacy days in the human rights world, but certainly when I worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is I knew the process for how Congress worked. I knew how to move. I knew how a bill got introduced to how it moved out of committee to then it moved to the Senate floor. And then hopefully the House also passed a similar bill. And then it became a law that was sent to the president's desk. And then the third P is politics. You need to, who are your champions? Who are your validators? That also applies to your networks. You can know how things become law. You can have the best law, but if the political winds are not behind it, none of that matters. And so those three P's have guided me a lot in my different parts of my career.
That's great. Okay, so now if they're looking to get into this field, one of the first questions is, can I have this amount of impact and still not be broke? Is this a field where how much money can folks expect to make in this field doing this type of work?
Money's always sensitive, right? But it's funny because I started off, talking about my how broke I was, especially early off in my career. I'm super fortunate that I make somewhere between $160,000 a year. Pretty sure I'm not the best at math, but around $160,000 a year and over, which you don't always hear in public service. I'm fortunate that I can live, like a middle income, middle class, life here and really support my family through that. And I work in government, right? Who thought that you can do that on a public service salary, and having worked in a nonprofit or having worked in Congress, which
Mhm.
is known for historically low salaries. So
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that's part of the reason why I asked the question, because I know that I worked in city government in New York and I saw what people were making. I was like, wait, we can actually live well and do really great work that is impactful and that can change your city, your state, your country, and international. But we just don't always think about government as a vehicle to have some
careers.
economic mobility. Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate that. And I do also appreciate that, I think the federal government also does a really good job at salary transparency. So I think it's just a matter of changing the stigma that you will be broke if you work in government to flipping it to like go out and do some research. There's actually some really interesting roles that you can have and do some good work.
No, absolutely true. And it's all the more important in communities that can't ask their parents about salary issues. Or when I was in the president of this organization, like I got asked, like, how do you even like do salary negotiations? Actually, my little brother is now a staff assistant in Capitol Hill. Similar conversations like, what does salary negotiation even look like? Or, when do I ask my boss for a raise? How do I ask for a raise? Should I ask for a raise? And like no one teaches us these things growing up. And so it's all the more reason why it's important to have mentors, to have sponsors, people that will help you get from one place to another. I think advice should be free.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's also why it's important to go to things like grad school or fellowships, right? Because now you have this family of folks like ICAP, right, which we mentioned
Exactly.
earlier. Like you can lean on people and you can get intel from people. Like, hey, I'm in philanthropy. This is what we're doing. This is what we're paying. Does that sound
Right.
right over there? And you can gut check it with your peers and really have a good understanding, and just people that can help you think through issues. Like, we have active group chats of, hey guys, I'm figuring this out. I don't know what to do. Has anyone done something similar? Or, hey y'all, I'm trying to hire someone. Does anyone know anyone? And that's how you kind of just create real fellowship amongst your peers and like stay connected, So definitely I hear you,
Completely agree.
and I appreciate that. Yeah. Even though we already did a really good ICAP commercial, but it's never enough. Yeah.
Never enough. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everyone should do it.
Are there any forms of media that could be books, podcasts, debate clubs, anything that you have
Join
experienced
your
or
local debate team.
nice?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I thought I was going to be a lawyer when I joined the high school debate team. Never even thought about going to law school after I really became interested in foreign policy. But it was a great opening to it. We didn't even get a full chance to talk about it. But I grew up reading comics and watching cartoons a ton growing up. And in terms of media, X-Men was like always on at my house, and X-Men '97 just came out recently on TV show. And part of the reason looking back at it, there was this motif about like the superhero club of like the sort of outcast of society, but they were heroes. And, we didn't even talk about this, but I also identify as gay, and being a gay Latino only child, first gen, you sometimes have these like questions about, whether we're really going to make it or whether we should make it. I always felt like cartoons really got me, and X-Men has this like very subtle motif about the LGBTQ community. So really recommend it, and just think that it's okay if your kids watch a lot of cartoons and comics. I swear it all works out in the end. So.
That's awesome. I will open it to say, are there things that you want to discuss and that you want the world to know about you? Because this is our floor, so we can do whatever we want with the time.
No, absolutely. I feel like we've already talked so much about running the gambit on both my career. I'll just say that for those who are interested in entering the space, a mentor once told me, it doesn't seem like it. And this was honestly when I was sleeping on the floor, like struggling to make ends meet, having tough conversations with my dad who was fighting cancer, and like wasn't sure if I was ever like cut out to make it in foreign policy. Just here to say one simple thing, which is you deserve to be here. Your voice matters. Your contribution, no matter how big, how small, matters. In my wildest dreams, never thought a single child, gay Latino kid from Queens, New York, had anything to contribute to foreign policy. Was super fortunate and privileged to sort of make it after some really tough strides. That, again, go back to the fact that my mom taught me or instilled in me this sort of curiosity about the world. And, I carry that with me. But it's a long way to say your value matters, and it's all going to work out. Just sort of continue to search for your dreams. And just, again, I never thought I would be where I am right now. And so just continue at it.
That's awesome. I think that's a great note to end on. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and believe on the mission we're on, please like, rate, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're using, and share this podcast with your friends in your networks. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at Career Cheat Code, and tell us people or careers you would like to see highlighted. See you next week with some more cheat codes. Peace.